She was 16 years old, an orphan standing on the platform of a rain-slicked depot in the Dakota Territory with $4 sewn into her cuff and no family left who would claim her. The man who saw to that was her mother's own brother, a merchant named Wendell Cobb, who had come from 2 counties over the moment her father died, declared himself her legal guardian before the ink on the death certificate had dried, and sold off everything her father owned within a fortnight, keeping the proceeds for himself and handing her only what he called her fair share, $4 silver, before putting her on the afternoon train out of town. With those same $4, she did not buy a room or a meal or a ticket further west. She walked instead to the freight yard behind the depot, where a condemned boxcar sat rotting on a forgotten siding, its paint peeling, its wheels rusted fast to the rails, and she paid the yard foreman every cent she had for a home nobody else wanted. It seemed to anyone watching like the last foolish act of a girl with nothing left to lose. But sealed beneath the floorboards of that abandoned car, hidden for years beneath dust and splintered wood, lay something that would not only save her, but would return to an entire town everything a powerful man had spent a decade quietly taking from it. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Josephine Hartwell. If you are watching this tonight from a place that feels as forgotten and rusted over as an old rail car left to rot on a siding, tell us in the comments, because this story was written for you. Josephine Hartwell, called Josie by everyone who loved her, had been born in a small clapboard house within sight of the rail yards of Larkspur Junction, a young Dakota Territory town that existed in those years, almost entirely because the railroad had decided it should. Her father, Elias Hartwell, was a car carpenter for the line, one of the quiet, competent men who built and repaired the wooden boxcars and cabooses that rattled through on the rails, a trade he had learned from his own father back east, and one he practiced with a patience that seemed, to young Josie, indistinguishable from love itself. She used to sit on an overturned crate in the corner of the car shop on Saturday mornings, watching her father plane a beam smooth or fit a joint so tight that no draft could ever find its way through. And he would tell her, in his slow and careful way, that a good car was built to outlast the men who built it, that the wood remembered every joint that was cut true and every one that was cut in haste, and that a builder's whole reputation lived inside walls most people would never think to examine closely. Her mother, Ruth, kept a small kitchen garden and took in mending from half the town, a bright, practical woman who taught Josie her letters before she taught her to sew, insisting that a girl ought to be able to read a contract as easily as she could a skirt, since the world, she said, was not always kind to women who could not tell when they were being cheated. It was her father, though, who gave her the particular skill that would matter most in the years to come. An eye for hidden structure, for the difference between a thing that looked solid and a thing that truly was. He used to walk her through the freight yard on Sunday afternoons, past the long rows of boxcars waiting to be loaded, and quiz her gently on which ones had been built with care and which had been thrown together by men in a hurry to collect their wages, teaching her to read the spacing of the nails, the fit of the boards, the way a good floor should feel almost seamless underfoot, while a poor one telegraphed every hollow space beneath it through the give of the wood. He told her once, crouched beside a car that had been retired from service after 20 years of hard use, that some builders left small marks of their own inside the cars they made, a carved initial in a hidden corner, a coin slipped beneath a floorboard for luck, little private signatures that no railroad inspector would ever think to look for. Because a man who spends his life building things other people walk over without a glance sometimes wants some small proof, however hidden, that he was there at all. Josie loved him fiercely for saying such things, for treating a boxcar shop like it held as much mystery and meaning as any church, and she carried that particular way of looking at the world, the habit of searching for what a careless eye would miss, long after the reasons for it changed entirely. Her mother died of a lung fever when Josie was 11, a loss that hollowed the little clapboard house of half its warmth and left Josie and her father to build a smaller, quieter life together out of what remained. He never remarried, throwing himself instead into his work and into raising his daughter with the same careful attention he gave his cars. teaching her not only carpentry but bookkeeping. Since the rail yard superintendent had come to trust Elias with certain small ledgers and inventories that a less careful man might have muddled. It was through this work, in her father's final years, that Josie first heard her father speak in a low and troubled voice at the supper table about a man named Cornelius Vane, the district land agent for the rail line, whose job it was to manage the company's right-of-way claims and the homestead parcels along the new spur line the railroad had recently pushed 20 miles north of Larkspur Junction. Elias never said outright that anything was wrong, since he was a cautious man who did not deal in accusations he could not prove. But Josie remembered the particular tightness in his jaw whenever Vane's name came up, and the way he sometimes stayed late at the car shop long after his ordinary work was finished. Bent over papers he never fully explained to her. Elias Hartwell died on a wet spring morning in his 49th year, crushed between two freight cars during a shunting accident that the railroad's own inquiry ruled an unfortunate mishap, a coupling that failed to hold in a rain-slicked yard, though a few of the older carmen muttered privately, out of Josie's hearing, that Elias had been unusually careful his whole working life and had never once misjudged a coupling before that particular morning. Josie was 16, entirely alone, with no brothers or sisters and no other family nearby save her mother's brother. Wendell Cobb, a dry goods merchant from a town 2 counties east who arrived within the week, expressed a grief that struck even the neighbors as thin and hurried, and set about settling her father's small estate with an efficiency that left no room for Josie's own wishes. He sold the clapboard house, sold her father's modest collection of tools, sold even the few pieces of her mother's good china, and informed Josie in the flattest possible tone that as her legal guardian he had arranged for her to travel west to distant relations who could take her in, handing her $4 silver as what he called her rightful share of the estate, and putting her alone onto the afternoon train. Josie did not go west. She stepped off at the very next stop, which happened to be Larkspur Junction itself, the only town she had ever called home, and stood on the wet platform in the rain with her father's old cedar toolbox, the one keepsake Cobb had not thought valuable enough to sell, clutched against her chest. She had nowhere to sleep and no family left to claim her, and it was in that state, cold and friendless and turning over in her mind what $4 might possibly buy a girl with nothing else in the world, that she wandered back toward the freight yard where she had spent so many Sunday afternoons at her father's side. There, on the forgotten siding at the yard's far edge, sat an old wooden boxcar that had been pulled from service years before, its paint faded to a ghost of its original maroon, weeds grown up thick around its rusted wheels. A car so far gone in the yard foreman's estimation that it was simply waiting for someone to haul it off for scrap lumber. The yard foreman, a gruff but not unkind man named Otis Pruitt, who had known her father for 20 years, told her plainly that the car was condemned and worthless, fit for nothing but firewood. But when Josie asked what he would take for it outright, more out of some stubborn instinct than any real plan, he named a price of $4 simply to be rid of the paperwork. And Josie handed over every coin she had before. She had fully decided to do it. She walked the short distance to the siding that same gray afternoon and stood for a long while outside the boxcar's sliding door before she found the strength to haul it open on its rusted track. The door groaned back to reveal a dim, musty interior, smelling of old wood and dust and years of stillness. And when her eyes adjusted to the gray light filtering through a few cracked slats near the roof, she saw that the car's interior, though clearly long abandoned, had once been fitted out with unusual care. A narrow built-in bunk along one wall, a small iron stove bolted in the corner, shelves fitted snugly into the framing in a way that spoke of a builder who had taken real pride in the work. Not a plain freight car at all, but what had once served, she guessed, as a private car for some rail official long since gone. In one corner, half hidden beneath a fallen shelf, she found a small brass plate screwed into the wood, engraved with a single name, E. Coyle, and beneath it a set of worn carpenter's tools hung on pegs exactly the way her own father used to hang his. Tools that told her, with a certainty she could not entirely explain, that whoever E. Coyle had been, he had understood wood the same devoted way her father had. She spent that first night in the car wrapped in her father's old canvas coat. Too exhausted and too proud to seek out charity from anyone in town who might have recognized her, and it was in the stillness before she finally slept that she noticed something her father's training had taught her to notice. A faint hollowness in the give of the floorboards near the built-in bunk. A sound and a feel entirely unlike the solid, seamless fit of the rest of the car's careful construction. She lay there turning the thought over for a long while, remembering her father's old lesson about builders who left private marks and hidden things inside the cars they made, and by the gray light of the following morning she found herself on her knees beside that bunk with one of E. Coyle's own chisels in her hand, working at the edge of a floorboard that came away after some careful effort, far more easily than any true nail-set plank should have. Beneath it, she found a shallow compartment built directly into the car's underframe, dry and undisturbed, containing a small iron strongbox and folded on top of it, a leather-bound ledger whose pages had gone brittle and brown with age. Her hands shook as she lifted the ledger free, and what she found inside, once she had steadied herself enough to read by the pale light through the cracked roof slats, was not a simple record of freight and wages, but a private, careful accounting kept in a meticulous hand, dated across nearly a decade, tracking something the writer referred to only as the Northern Claims. Interspersed with columns of figures were notes in the same careful hand, brief and increasingly troubled, describing how homestead parcels along the new spur line north of town, land legally granted to settling families under the railroad's own land grant agreements, had been quietly and systematically declared forfeit for supposed failures to complete required improvements within the legal deadline, forfeitures that returned the land not to the settlers who had lost it, but directly into parcels controlled by the district land agent himself, a man the ledger named plainly again and again. As Cornelius Vane, tucked into the ledger's final pages, was a letter, unsigned but written in the same hand, explaining that its author, evidently the very E. Coyle whose name was on the brass plate, had served for years as the rail line's own paymaster and record keeper for the Northern Spur, and had slowly come to realize entry by entry that the deadlines used to void so many homestead claims had themselves been quietly falsified in the company's own filings, altered just enough to make honest families appear to have missed legal windows they had, in fact, met faithfully. The letter's author wrote that he had gathered proof, copies of original filings smuggled from the land office before they could be altered, comparisons against the doctored company records, enough evidence to unravel the entire scheme, but that he had grown too old, too alone, and too afraid of a man with Vane's reach to bring it forward himself. And so he had done the only thing that felt safe to a man who had spent his life building things meant to outlast him, hidden the proof inside the very car he had once called his own, sealed it beneath a floor he had built with his own two hands, and trusted that someone patient enough someday would come looking beneath the surface of a thing everyone else had already written off as worthless. Josie sat on the cold floor of that boxcar for a long while after reading it, the strongbox still unopened in her lap, and understood, with a clarity that steadied her far more than it frightened her, that she had not stumbled onto some simple lost fortune. She had found a debt owed to families she did not yet know, evidence of a wrong that had been quietly done to an entire stretch of the territory for the better part of a decade, and a dead man's last, careful act of faith that someone honest would eventually come along to finish what he had been too afraid to finish himself. The strongbox, once she worked its old lock free with one of Coyle's own tools, held a modest sum of railroad company scrip and coin, enough to matter to a girl who owned nothing, but the true weight of what she had found lay in the papers themselves. Copies of original homestead filings bearing dates that flatly contradicted the forfeiture notices the company had issued, proof, plain and damning, that at least 11 families along the Northern Spur had been cheated out of legally earned land through nothing more than falsified paperwork. Word of a strange orphan girl living alone in an old boxcar traveled quickly through a town as small as Larkspur Junction, and it did not take a full week before Cornelius Vane himself came walking out to the siding, a tall, immaculately dressed man with the easy, unhurried manner of someone accustomed to being believed. to inform Josie, not unkindly on the surface, that any company records found on railroad property belonged to the railroad itself, and that a girl alone in the world, with no family and no standing, would find it very difficult indeed to make trouble for a man of his position. He offered her in the same breath a small sum of money to simply hand over whatever she had found and forget she had ever found it, a sum that would have seemed, to a girl with $4 to her name only days before, like more wealth than she had ever imagined possessing. Josie thought of her father's hands guiding hers along a beam cut true, of her mother's insistence that a girl learn to read a contract as carefully as a hymn, and she told Cornelius Vane, with a steadiness that surprised even her, that she intended to have the papers examined by the Territorial Land Office before she handed over so much as a single page. Vane's smile did not waver, but the pressure on her began almost immediately, quiet and indirect the way such pressure so often is. The yard foreman, Otis Pruitt, who had sold her the car in good faith and had begun bringing her bread and coffee out of a rough, fatherly kindness, was warned that his own position depended on staying clear of the girl's business. A young freight hand named Peter Nash, 14 years old and full of the same restless curiosity Josie herself had once shown around her father's car shop, had taken to helping her sort through the old ledger's pages after his own shifts ended. And he too was told, by an anonymous word passed through the yard, that his family's small store credit might not survive his continued involvement. For several difficult weeks that spring, Josie found herself standing nearly alone against a man who controlled land, wages, and reputation across half the county, with only a boy, a rough-mannered foreman, and a dead man's careful old proof standing beside her. She did not fight Vane in the open, where his polish and standing would always outmatch a 16-year-old orphan's word, but instead did the patient. Careful work her father had trained into her without either of them ever calling it training at all. With Peter's help, given quietly and against his family's fear, she rode out to visit as many of the 11 affected homestead families as she could reach, laying Coyle's copied filings alongside whatever deeds and letters the families themselves still possessed, and found again and again that the dates and details matched perfectly, family after family telling variations of the very same story, an improvement deadline they were certain they had met, followed by a forfeiture notice that arrived with strange speed and left them with no real means to contest it. She wrote out a full and careful account of everything she had found, in her mother's own patient, plain-spoken hand, and sent copies not merely to the county courthouse where Vane's influence ran deep, but directly to the Territorial Land Office some considerable distance away, alongside sworn statements from 6 of the affected families willing to put their names to what had happened to them. The territorial inspector who eventually arrived in Larkspur Junction, a careful, unhurried man named Garrity, who had seen enough land fraud across the territory to recognize its shape immediately, spent the better part of 2 weeks comparing Coyle's smuggled original filings against the railroad's own official company records, and what he found confirmed every troubled entry in the old ledger down to the smallest detail. The falsified deadlines were laid bare, parcel by parcel, and the ruling that eventually came down restored full legal title to every one of the 11 families whose claims had been wrongly voided. Land they had worked and improved in good faith and very nearly lost forever to a scheme built on nothing more than altered dates in a filing cabinet. Cornelius Vane was stripped of his position with the railroad and barred from ever again holding any office involving land administration in the territory, and though the criminal proceedings against him moved slowly and settled, in the end, for restitution rather than prison, his name became one that was no longer spoken with the same easy respect anywhere along that rail line. Even Wendell Cobb, Josie's own uncle, found his hurried handling of her father's estate drawing unwelcome attention once the inspector's inquiry began turning over records across the county, since a closer look at the estate sale revealed he had undervalued several of her father's assets and pocketed the difference. A smaller dishonesty than Vane's, but a real one nonetheless. And he was made, under quiet threat of his own legal trouble, to send Josie a portion of what he owed her, money she accepted without warmth, but without refusal either. What Josie did with the scrip and coin from beneath the boxcar floor, and with the quiet gratitude of 11 families who had feared losing everything, was never a choice that troubled her for very long. Since her father's old lessons about patient, careful work had left little room in her for taking more than her share. She used a portion of the money to make the old boxcar properly livable, adding a real door and a proper stovepipe. But she kept it exactly where it stood on the siding rather than moving into anything grander, feeling that the car itself and the patient dead man who had built it and trusted it with his last honest secret deserved to remain part of whatever came next. She set aside the larger remainder. Together with small contributions, the grateful homestead families insisted on making despite her own protests, to establish a modest freight office and reading room at the edge of the yard, a place where any family working the northern spur could come to have their land papers checked and copied properly, free of charge, so that no one in Larkspur Junction would ever again lose a home to a quietly altered date on a filing cabinet page. Peter Nash, whose family's fear had eased considerably once Vane's influence collapsed, became her steady partner in the work, learning to read a ledger and a deed with the same careful eye Josie had learned from her own father, and it gave her a particular quiet joy to watch him grow into exactly the kind of patient, careful man that old E. Coyle had once been, and that her own father had been before him. And so it was, in the end, that Josephine Hartwell, 16 years old and standing on a rain-slicked platform with $4 silver and no family left to call her own, turned out to be exactly the patient, watchful person that a frightened old paymaster had been waiting years to find, though the two of them had never once met, and though he had died without ever knowing her name. She had been cast aside by a man who mistook her youth and her aloneness for weakness, and she had answered that mistake not with anger, but with the same quiet, careful attention her father had spent a lifetime teaching her. The belief that a thing left to rot on a forgotten siding is not therefore a thing without worth. That sometimes the truth an entire town badly needs is hidden in plain sight beneath the very floor everyone else has already stopped looking at. The old boxcar that had seemed, on that gray and friendless afternoon, like the last desperate purchase of an orphaned girl, became instead the very place where 11 families got their land back, and a whole stretch of the territory learned to trust its own records again. And those who had once seen only a worthless, rusting car came in time to understand that Josie had bought something far more valuable than $4 worth of scrap lumber. She had bought the patience to look beneath the surface and the courage to bring what she found there into the light. Thank you for spending this time with Josephine's story tonight, and with everything it was meant to bring to mind about the quiet, overlooked places in our own lives. If this story stirred something in you, we would love to hear it in the comments below. And we ask this honestly. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something the world had already written off as worthless? A person, a place, or a possession nobody else thought was worth a second look until you were patient enough to search beneath the surface. Share it with us and with each other, because we believe this community is built on exactly that kind of quiet, patient hope. If you enjoyed this journey to Larkspur Junction, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell so you never miss the next story waiting for you. And if you know someone who needs reminding that overlooked things can still hold everything, send this one their way. Until next time, stay close.